Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this panel discussion on the Institut Universitaire de Hautes Études Internationales and Neoliberalism, Historical Perspectives. Thanks. Yeah, that gets rid of the echo. So this is a very timely panel discussion, seeing as we are proceeding towards the centenary of the Institute in 2 years' time, and reckoning with the past of which this Institute has been a part is, I think, a very important aspect of marking the centenary. We're very pleased and privileged to have with us this extraordinarily distinguished panel. But before I introduce the panel, I was told that I should introduce myself because I'm not, contrary to my expectations, Cyrus Kayag. I am G. Balachandran. I am an honorary professor at the Graduate of International History and Politics at the Institute and co-directing the Albert Hirschman Center on Democracy. With me in the panel today, and I shall introduce the panel in the order in which they will intervene this afternoon, is Professor Quinn Slobodian, who is a well-known historian, professor of international history at the School of Global Studies at Boston University. I imagine much of the discussion today will revolve around his own work in 2 books ago, The Globalists, in which Quinn discusses quite extensively the place of the Geneva School in the trajectories of neoliberalism. Subsequent to Globalists, he's published 2 more books, Crack Up Capitalism, Market Radicals, and The Dream of a World Without Democracy. And before anyone could read that book, he has come out with Hayek's Bastards, just published last week, I imagine. So he writes faster than most of us can read. Race, Gold, IQ, and the Capitalism of the Far Right. After Quinn, Quinn will be followed by Dieter Plewey, Senior Fellow at the Research Group on Globalization, Work and Production at the Wissenschaftszentrum Berlin, and teaching also at the Kassel University Institute of Political Science. And I have followed Dieter's work with admiration for a very long time, particularly his work on the history of neoliberalism, the making of a thought collective, I think, on the Chicago School of Economics, and with Quinn and Philip Mirowski, more recently, a volume published by Verso on the 9 Lives of Neoliberalism. Following Dieter is Professor Sandrine Kott. Sandrine, I think, needs no introduction, especially to historians in this room, Professor of Modern European History at the University of Geneva and Global Distinguished Professor at NYU, working on labor and social history across capitalist and socialist societies. And she's currently working on international organizations, particularly the ILO, as sites for the circulation of knowledge and expertise in economic and social affairs. Last but not least, our own local celebrity, Professor Alice Perlow, Assistant Professor of International Law at the Geneva Graduate Institute, who, prior to joining us here at the Institute, was a Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford University Center for Business Taxation and a Research Fellow with the Belgian Fund for Scientific Research. So I propose that Quinn kick off the discussion, and then Dieter Plewey, and then Sandrine Kott, and finally Alice Perlow. Quinn, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Yes. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. And thank you to Bala for being the ersatz Cyrus, and to my panel mates, and to Marie-Laure for inviting, and Laurence for coordinating everything. So I think this is going to be one of those everyone has a little part of the elephant type situations, the elephant in this case being the history of the Graduate Institute. I will reproduce in, I think, about the 6 minutes or so that we've been granted, more or less the narrative of chapter 2 of said book, Globalists, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, where I chart what I think is still, upon rereading it for the first time in many years, a pretty interesting and strange thing that happened over the course of the 1920s and 1930s, in the course of which time this place is birthed. What happened across that period, and what I describe in some ways as the birth of neoliberalism as an intellectual movement, is there's a switch of attitude amongst people who are primarily interested in safeguarding the international division of labor and economic freedom and the sanctity of the world economy as they know it. The switch goes something like this. In the late 1920s, in the attempt to reconstruct the world economy that had been shattered by the First World War, there was a belief for a while that the exercise of statistics could be adequate to the task of reestablishing the ties that had been broken by the conflict of the Great War. So across Europe, and indeed across the world, you get the emergence of what became known as business cycle research institutes. And this was a pretty revolutionary epistemological step, as well as kind of a practical step, because the first time there was a belief that you could envision and represent the economy as an entity that had a line that moved across time, that could be visualized in graphs of charts of numbers and statistics, and that could thereby be amenable to some kind of intervention, some kind of forward planning, some kind of rational management in a way that actually you hadn't been able to do before the First World War. Before the First World War, there was nothing like a comprehensive gathering of income statistics, of unemployment statistics, of trade statistics, let alone the concept that these things might move in more or less predictable waves that became known as the business cycle. So this is really, in intellectual history terms, kind of a breakthrough of the 1920s and early 1930s. We can actually see the world economy. It exists. It's a thing. And it wasn't predetermined in advance. So one of the things that I have in my book is the program for a gathering of economists that went from Geneva down to Annecy. And the program said, we're getting together to try to figure out if there really is something that can be called a world economy. And if so, how we would be able to represent it, track it, chart it, give it a statistical coherence. So that's the first extraordinary thing I think that happens in the 1920s, and Geneva is the center of that research in many ways. Alexander Loveday, who heads up the economic section of the League of Nations, and Alexander Salter, also at the League of Nations, acts as a coordinator for the many business cycle research institutes that spring up, often with Rockefeller Foundation funding, not coincidentally the same funding that allows for the creation of this very institute. So there's a network of economists and knowledge producers who hope that they can create this world of numbers, as I describe it, that can help to recreate the unity of the world economy that has been lost. The twist in the story, what happens over the course of the 1930s, as the Great Depression hits and as it gets processed and reacted to by these economists, by policymakers, by social movements, by radicalized workers across the world, is that by the end of the 1930s, the very people who had been involved in creating that world of numbers start to get worried that actually, by creating a statistical entity called the economy, they haven't stabilized liberal international order. They've actually inadvertently put weapons into the hands of the left, socialists, who can now use those very numbers and those very charts and statistics as a way to, as they see it, step over the limits of private property, step over the limits of the correct ordering around private and public ownership, and to start doing the things that would later be called Keynesianism, that would later be called industrial policy, the stuff that is embodied in the Beveridge Plan, the kind of thing that gets rolled out also by right-wing collectivist governments in the 1930s. So from being in love with statistics, which is something that brings them here and sort of acts in many ways as the kernel of what becomes the neoliberal project, here at the Graduate Institute, Wilhelm Rübke comes from his Turkish exile to here to oversee what was called an international economic observatory. Once it seems like the left is now picking up on numbers, they decide that actually statistics is not the royal road to economic order, that it might actually be the royal road to the further dissolution and fragmentation of the world economy. So where do they go from there? Enter this famous moment in neoliberal history, the Walter Lippmann Colloquium in Paris in 1938, which is really an extension of the Geneva Project. It's a moment in which people who would otherwise be gathering here gather in Paris, people from the International Studies Conference, people from the Institute of Intellectual Cooperation at the League of Nations, people like Rübke and Ludwig von Mises, who by this time were already working at the Graduate Institute, gather in Paris, and they say the statistical experiment has gone awry. It has basically gone off the rails. The real crime, actually, against liberalism, against international order, is the belief that you can have a view of the totality. And that is the core of the engineering mindset. That is the core of the idea of the planner that is leading to the New Deal in the United States and is leading to Keynesian intervention and fascist planning elsewhere. So rather than focusing on the economy as such, trade statistics, unemployment statistics, income statistics, the neoliberal project has to be about guarding what they call, again and again, the extra economic conditions for liberalism, which means attention to things like morality and tradition, but more and more around the question of law. So the ordering quality of law, which creates a framework within which the magic of the market can take place without ever trying to see actually the essence of what the economy is, becomes the trademark of what I then call in my book the Geneva School. From that decade of the 1920s and 30s onward, there is a sort of genealogy that I track right up to just about the day before yesterday with someone like Petersmann, who was associated with the Geneva School, the Graduate Institute until a few years ago. The essence of the Geneva School of neoliberalism, as I understand it, being a focus on the utility of law as an ordering practice in protecting the world economy, not in tracking and charting the world economy in granular detail, but in producing a set of ground rules, expectations, and even enforceable rules above and beyond governments that can make sure that certain core principles of investor security, private property, and predictability are not overstepped. So that's, I think, how much of my book I have time left to recount, but that's, I think, this very interesting genesis moment, which is like both a belief in statistics and then a refutation of statistics that happens like almost immediately. And then in that moment of dialectic sort of supersession, I think, launches what I think we can safely describe as a separate intellectual lineage associated with this very place, if not this rather modern auditorium.
Yes, I can also say thank you for having this chance to, after visiting Mont Pèlerin last year for the first time, now having, thanks to you, the chance to visit another birthplace. Quinn has given neoliberalism the base camp of Mont Pèlerin. Yes, the base camp. Quinn has given the birthplace for the Vienna address of Mises and Hayek's Business Cycle Research Institute. Arne Kettner recently gave as a birthplace Tiergartenstraße in Berlin, the workplace for Rüstov, who was actually heading a business association, but was very actively involved in the 20s in the development of what now we call neoliberalism. And the Geneva Institute for all the reasons that Quinn has worked out in Globalists, that it was clear, and that's basically the base definition for neoliberalism, the distance to the older free market laissez-faire belief, naturalized belief of capitalism, that the capitalist order needs to be stabilized. The market is not self-sustaining. And whereas this was basically clearly worked out before at the national level for national economies, the Geneva School work of Quinn basically demonstrated in which ways this was essential also for the work on the international order. And therefore, very justifiably, the Switzerland and the Geneva Address should be considered a birthplace, even if it's a bit later than possibly the others. But in the history writing of neoliberal networks, individuals, intellectuals, organizations, Switzerland actually was passed by almost until Quinn's work. And maybe still there is actually quite a bit of work left to do on the Swiss sort of like circles. Andrea Frank has now written a little bit about it, and I have a hunch, I've not myself worked, and now for this purpose here, looked for the first time in a way a bit closer to William Rappard and a few other people, and found it really interesting that, for example, this Rockefeller Foundation funding for the Institute, alongside the funding of the business cycle research institutes that Quinn mentioned. And I think there's still quite a bit of work to do to actually look at the history of and genesis of neoliberalism and intellectual work, academic work from the perspective of these funding agents. And here maybe in particular is an interesting American-Swiss axis, so to speak, because not only was Rockefeller obviously, and Rappard basically embodies as a person was born in the United States and had studied at Harvard and was sort of like well entrenched in American circles. But also Hans Sulzer, the industrialist who was in charge of early funding of Mont Pèlerin Society meetings and was one of the big sort of like friends of sort of like from the industrial side, he was very closely cooperating with the Carnegie people. So we have an interesting link between US philanthropy and Swiss sort of like industrial and financial circles that I think need exploring. And well, the very fact that this institute was funded for the first, what was it, 20 years of its life exclusively by American sources obviously makes it a very interesting story in itself. There was from a very cryptic, and that's exactly where we know that historians haven't done the work yet, from very cryptic information in a Wikipedia entry on Rappard, it was known that Rappard was angry with the Rockefeller Foundation that apparently suggested toward the end of the 1930s that, that the Institute here should only work on economics. And hearing Quinn now, it comes to my mind that this shift of the agenda from economics to actually legal and even moral issues might in fact have been one of the reasons that the criticism of Geneva people of the business cycle research project might actually have sitten not very well with the Rockefeller Foundation funding all this business cycle research work. But this is an hypothesis, and maybe there are some students in the room who want to go to Sleepy Hollow in New York and make good use of the great archive of the Rockefeller Foundation and write a new history of the what we could call, for lack of better words, the knowledge power structure of the 20th century as it was transformed by the Rockefeller Foundation, by way of really assembling a history of these different academic institutions that were actually evolving based on funding by this American foundation that obviously has also done other stuff. And of course, this is a history that is tied into the origin of neoliberalism very much, as this place was filled with people William Rappard invited that became later a part of the Mont Pèlerin Society, Mises, Röpke, Halperin, Voegelin, many others. But also Rappard invited here people like Hans Kelsen, or saved from the fascist persecution, Hans Weberg and Walter Schücking, who were the founders of the international pacifist, the pacifist international law. So very interesting also the ambivalences that at that time, of course, were still characteristic. And even in the first meeting, Ola Inset has written a nice book about the first meeting of Mont Pèlerin, following the discussions where Rapin was on one hand a big Mises fan, but then was characterized as being actually to the left of Mises and thinking differently about trade unions. Then very traditionalist thinking along with Röpke along the question of the global South countries. So one thing, the thought collective category that we have developed has done, of course, is a bit over unifying perspectives. And I think from this early history and then the shift of that is visible after World War II, we have to actually make room for such ambivalences and try to explain why Rockefeller was absolutely part and parcel of the funding of the early history of neoliberalism, but then disappeared in the 1950s, 60s, and was not anymore among the group of funders of this wider circles that then emerged. But there's a lot of work to do, and I'm glad that this historical event may spark new interest and new research in this area. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for inviting me and for being in such a good company. So in this brief presentation, because I will say that I have only 7 minutes, which is not a lot, I will attempt to answer the questions that brings us together. How was Geneva's Institut des hautes études internationales involved in the making of neoliberalism from the 1930s and the emergence of the Geneva School, which has been explained to us by Quinn already. So I don't want to deny the roots of neoliberalism in Geneva during the interwar period, or the role that William Rapin played in bringing some neoliberal economists to the Graduate Institute in the 1930s, but I would like to present a kind of counter-narrative based on my knowledge of what was happening at the ILO, International Labour Organization, and the League of Nations, with which a Graduate Institute was closely connected. We tend to forget that the French economist historian Paul Mantoux, known for his important book on the Industrial Revolution in Britain, was a co-founder and the co-director of the Graduate Institute until 1951. So, who is Paul Mantoux? Paul Mantoux belongs to the group of socialist intellectuals of the École Normale Supérieure de la Rue d'Ulm, around his well-known librarian Lucien Eyre. There, he became friend with the socialist historian Albert Thomas, who everybody knows because he became the first director of the International Labour Organization. During the war, Mantoux joined Albert Thomas in the Under-Secretariat for Armament, the place par excellence for learning about the importance of state regulation, so completely different from everything we've heard about the neoliberal. And as we know, World War I has been the crucible of state planning experience. And Mantoux never just forgot about this experience during the First World War. Like William Rapin, Mantoux was in Versailles for the peace conference, serving as an interpreter for Georges Clemenceau. We should not forget that it was a very important international experience, this Versailles Treaty. Like Rapin, he joined the Secretariat of the League of Nations, becoming the director of its political section. So, in certain the same trajectory. While in Geneva, he remained close to Albert Thomas, who became the first director of the International Labour Office. In 1954, he even founded the Société Le Souvenir d'Albert Thomas and became its president. Also, he was not a committed socialist. He showed support to social reform. In 1934, he joined the Bureau d'études sociales, Social Studies Office, which was set up by the French reformist trade unionist Léon Jouot. Léon Jouot represented the workers at the Versailles Conference and then became a long-time representative of the worker at the ILO governing body. Through Mantoux, another network and other intellectual inspiration and tradition are emerging at the Graduate Institute. And it is what I want to stress. The Durkheimian Circle, with which Mantoux has been closely associated since his time at the École Normale Supérieure. A network which was well represented in Geneva, in particular at the International Labour Organization. The sociologist Marine Dermier-Meraille has shown that Albert Thomas, the office director of the ILO, has hired not less than 10 representatives of this Durkheimian school to work for the International Labour Organization in the 1920s and the 1930s. Among them, Simeon, who is very well known, but there are a lot of others. We don't know really about Mauss. I had this discussion with Grégoire before, because he was asked, but he didn't really deliver a report that he was supposed to write. Unlike neoliberals it happened very often at the ILO anyway, so unlike neoliberals of the Viennese school, so not the German one, which who have been already mentioned, the French sociologist Émile Durkheim emphasized the importance of the society as a current rule and the role of the state. For him and for the Durkheimians, the state had to intervene to regulate the negative dissolving effects of capitalism, what he calls anomie, such as inequality, excessive individualism, and to preserve social cohesion. This emphasis on social regulation and economic also regulation is really at the core of the task of the International Labour Organization. It's a raison d'être. But this doesn't only concern the International Labour Organization in Geneva at this time. So I just want to propose a kind of counter-narrative. Because if we look at the League of Nations, the most important outcome of the League of Nations is certainly the League Health Organization, which has been set up by the Polish socialist, the medical doctor, Ludwig Rachman, and which was the antecedent of the World Health Organization. And it's certainly the most successful organization, the most successful institution of the League of Nations, and certainly not the economic section of the League of Nations. So at the Graduate Institute itself, we should not forget that there were also social democrats. Don't forget that, for example, Gunnar Myrdal, the very well-known Swedish social democrat, has taught at the Institute in the early 1930s and was even a board member of the Institute for almost 10 years. So that's a kind of, counter-narrative, which I don't deny that your narrative is okay, is right, of course. But there is also another narrative, and it's important just to remember that this tradition is also part of the tradition of the Graduate Institute, and that we have, to remember it. So I don't know if I still have time. Do I still have time? Okay, so because I wanted in fact to propose another interpretation which has nothing to do with what I have presented now. So the other interpretation is about the religion, which I'm working on right now. So if we follow not Mantoux, but if we follow Rapart again, we have to insert him in this kind of Protestant tradition with this Protestant tradition which is so important in Geneva, in Switzerland in general, and in particular in Geneva. So here I think we have to take seriously the specifically Protestant culture of Rapart, and to emphasize, as Michel Foucault has done previously, that neoliberalism is not just an economic program, but also a kind of ethic or moral imperative in a certain way. So the connections that I am making here, and it's more an intuition than really a kind of, because I am really at the beginning of this research, is linked to recent work that I have done in the archives of the World Council of Churches, located just across the ILO, by the way. So it's very easy for me to go from one place to the other. So now the archives are closed, by the way, the World Council of Churches. Working on the documents produced by the Committee of the Transnational Corporation in the 1970s, I discovered how the Protestant churches looked at the question of the regulation of capitalism through a particular prism, which I find is a prism which they share with neoliberal, which is the ethic of responsibility. And in the document I have consulted, this responsibility lies primarily with employers. Rather than subjecting companies to restrictive regulation, employers should be encouraged to adopt virtuous behavior which demonstrates their kind of moral superiority. This question of responsibility, clearly formulated in the World Council of Churches founding program in 1948, is an inspiration for the language of corporate social responsibility, which is one of the forms taken by what I call the neoliberal ideology, which circulated widely in the international labor, in the international organization, even in the International Labour Organization, by the way, after the 1980s. In 2000, Kofi Annan, a deeply religious Presbyterian, presented the Global Compact, which proposes a direct agreement between the UN and large corporations bypassing governments. In some respects, the Global Compact may be seen a kind of realization of global governance of capitalism dreamed by the Viennese neoliberals that you describe in your book, Quinn. In his speech, Kofi Annan depicted the Global Compact like that, business as a force of good. And so I think that's a second way of looking at, in a certain way, how neoliberalism can be interpreted as a kind of ethical discourse, ethical and religious discourse.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Thank you, Sandrine.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It really gave me the opportunity to reflect on the history of my academic home. I'd say my new academic home, because I've been in Geneva for around 2 years now, so it's still relatively recent. I'm a professor, assistant professor in the international law department, so I'm clearly less of an expert on today's topic than my co-panelists. That said, I'll still try to shed some light on the role of the Institute in the making of neoliberalism, which I understand in the same way as you describe it in your book. So this wonderful book on the Globalists, where you describe the neoliberal project as a project focused on the designing of institutions and rules to encase the market. So I'll divide my talk into two main parts. First, I'd like to shed some light on the role of legal scholars and legal experts, in particular those based in Geneva with strong connections to the Institute, in the promotion of legal institutions and legal norms aimed at fostering neoliberal thoughts. This is obviously not to say that all legal scholars based at the Institute were inspired by Hayek's approach to the economy. It's also not to say that that neoliberal ideas were primarily advanced by legal scholars rather than scholars from other disciplines such as historians and economists. We've mentioned many already, but it's more a way for me to draw on my own disciplinary background to reflect on today's topic. And second, I'd like to use my own field of expertise, namely international tax law, to put into perspective the role of legal scholars based in Geneva in the neoliberal project. International tax law is an interesting legal area to discuss in the context of neoliberalism, because tax is often viewed as one of the key features of the state, a key attribute of the state, a key feature of democracy. But at the same time, from a neoliberal perspective, tax is also an encroachment, a potential encroachment on the market and the right to property. So the hypothesis I'd like to make is the following. Though some legal experts who had strong links with the Institute played a key role in advancing neoliberalism in certain areas, such as international trade law, their role seemed much more limited, if not inexistent, in another key field for the neoliberal project, namely international tax law. So let me start with the first part of this statement, namely that legal scholars and experts with connections to the Institute contributed to the development of neoliberal institutions in the field of international trade law. And the book by Quinn Slobodian that I mentioned before clearly illustrates the key role of lawyers in the neoliberal project. You've explained that today also very clearly. Two of the lawyers that are named in the book had strong links with the Institute, so I'll briefly mention them. The first one is Ernst Ulrich Petersmann, who you've also mentioned. He was a visiting professor at the Institute from 1993 to 1997, and then an associate professor up to 2002. He also worked for the GATT and the WTO, and his professional life and his academic writings were very much inspired by the work of Hayek because he studied with him. The second figure that I'd like to briefly mention is Friede Rosler. He studied law at the Institute, and among other professional activities, he served as the director of legal affairs at the World Trade Organization. He clearly contributed to the intellectual foundation of the WTO dispute settlement system. So I should probably mention here that both Petersmann and Rosler wrote book reviews of your book. They praised the book, but at the same time, they sort of to disagree with the label of neoliberalism. So, for instance, Petersmann rejects that label, and instead he seems to prefer the label of what he calls the Geneva School of multi-level order liberalism. The goal of which was to promote, and so I'll be quoting him here, multi-level legal, institutional and judicial guarantees of non-discriminatory market competition, limiting abuses of public and private powers. So I'll not go into the debate of how Petersmann's view should be labeled, but it seems clear to me that the Institute, through at least one of its law professors and one of its alumni, contributed to the development of institutions such as the WTO. And they were inspired by the idea that the WTO should be the guardian of market competition with the ultimate aim of putting limits to what Petersmann calls governance failures. Again, we could call those failures differently, right? So interestingly, the same failures did not seem to attract the attention of the members of the Geneva School in the context of international tax law. It's puzzling, as international tax law, to some extent, shares the same underlying objective of international trade law, namely to promote capital mobility. So why, then, did Geneva seem to play less of a role in tax? By this question, I do not mean that Geneva, and more generally Switzerland, did not play any role in tax matters. It's well known that Switzerland has had very preferential tax regimes, including for foreign capital. So rather, what I'm referring to is the fact that Switzerland is not seen as the place for international tax law and tax policy. So I have two questions to the question I've just asked. One of those answers is more anecdotal and personal to some extent. The other is more grounded in academic research. So I'll start with the latter. The first reason for the limited role of the Graduate Institute, and more broadly speaking, Geneva, in the development of international tax law is linked to the physical location of institutions working on international tax law. In international tax law scholarship, it's often said that international tax law takes place in Paris at the OECD, and some would say at the ICC, the International Chamber of Commerce. So this has not always been the case. Initially, the League of Nations and later the United Nations were interested in tax law because they viewed double taxation and tax evasion as policy problems. However, the Fiscal Commission that had been established in 1946 to work on international tax relations stopped functioning in 1954, which made it possible for the Organizations for European Economic Cooperation, later the OECD, to become the most influential organization working on tax. So though the UN re-established the tax committee in 1967, it never played a significant role in tax ever since, though this might change in the future. And this leads me to my second reason, which is interlinked but more anecdotal, for the limited role of Geneva in international tax law. For better or worse, and we should ask students, the Institute did not seem to have any law professors specialized in tax up to relatively recently. So from what I understand, I'm the first professor specialized in this field. Interestingly, this institutional change, which corresponds to a very personal change for me, is taking place in parallel to important tax reforms at the United Nations. The negotiations of what could become the first United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation have started this year, mostly in New York. I should mention here that the push for such negotiations has come from developing countries who were unsatisfied with the dominance of OECD countries. This might give the impression that the neoliberal agenda is being counterbalanced by a new international economic order. And I conclude with those words. I was wondering when preparing this talk whether I should end with a positive note or a negative one. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Before I throw the floor open for questions, I'm sure, a lot of food for thought, very rich discussion. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. I must say that this discussion has thrown up two sets of issues. I guess the first is the role of the old Graduate Institute of International Studies in incubating neoliberalism and probably seeing it through to the 1950s, 1960s, the Mont Pèlerin phase, and so on. And the second question is, how far does this phase of the Institute define the Institute, where there are other voices in the Institute, where there are other influences at the Institute, and so on. And since the centenary is also at some level a branding exercise, it's very, I think, a great source of relief for all of us to know that there is this other face to the Institute that Sandrine Kott brought out. And listening to Alice at first, I thought maybe we had some radical tax lawyers at the Graduate Institute who might actually reinforce this dimension of the Institute, but your story is a story of absence until you came along with your radical positions. I guess the story of Gunnar Myrdal and what's happening to Geneva at this time is also partly a story that culminates in the creation of the Graduate Institute of Development Studies, with its emphasis on degrowth and so on, with Gilbert Rist. And I must kind of bring up my favorite joke here from the period of the merger between the two institutes in 2007, which was widely touted in the Geneva press as a marriage of Paul Wolfowitz, who was then the president of the World Bank and a neocon, and José Bové, who, as many of you in the room would know, was a leader of the French anti-globalization peasant movement. So we can go into questions about the history of neoliberalism and the place that the Institute played. But I'm very, very curious about the fact that somehow the economists figure less in the story of neoliberalism, even where the Institute is concerned, than lawyers. And in a way, the Rockefeller Foundation's project in setting up the Institute was to scientize international relations, make international relations a subject of science rather than of politics, and neoclassical economics, in a way, does the same thing. So the history of the Institute also makes us think more deeply about the relationship between science and ideology. And when you think about the relationship between science and ideology, then perhaps some of the issues you raised about, business cycle as science ceases to serve certain ideological purposes, and so ideology then begins to trump science. So just to evoke the richness of the issues that we can address at the level of institutional, intellectual, as well as the history of the social sciences in thinking about the history of the Institute. So thank you all very much. And if you have a couple of minutes to comment on one another, then I'm happy to pass the floor to you. Otherwise, I shall pass the floor to you.
Yeah, no, these were great and really helpful. I thought that it would be worth mentioning this actually extraordinary symmetry that the centenary now will be falling on, because what people were doing in Geneva in the 1920s and 30s, I think, just to sort of clarify my claims too, at large was not trying to create something called neoliberalism, right? Like the problem of Geneva and the spirit of Geneva, as it was described frequently in the 20s and 30s, was the problem of the world, right? It was the problem of reassembling what was seen as an ecumenical planetary community, either in nascence or somehow completed by 1914, that had been destroyed by the First World War. And so how one reassembled that world was being approached from many, many different angles. So I describe briefly in my chapter about when the Palais Wilson opened, there were 30 different international organizations in it that were all trying to reassemble the world in different ways. There was the International Labor Organization, there was something for the rights of women, there was something for the question of religion, there was something about prevention of cruelty to animals. Right, these were all people who were trying to, in their own way, address the problem of the world. So the part of this story that I'm telling is one small sliver, actually. And the interesting thing, I think, the reason why I think they got left out in the cold by Rockefeller, and Bala was just hinting at this himself, is they kind of self-marginalized themselves, actually. They were in the middle of the pack as far as scientizing economics, scientizing the problem of international relations. And then because they saw the way that the pack was moving, i.e. towards planning, towards Keynesianism, towards everything we associate with post-1945 models of international political economy, they freaked out and ran to the margins to become critics again of what they saw as a deviant mainstream, right? So this isn't actually about the creation of what was a hegemonic common sense in 1920s or 30s, far from it. These were minority characters who were actually not important, you could say, for a long time. And it was actually only when they set up themselves, and this is why I think it's interesting that Petersman says, I won't call myself a neoliberal, but I will call myself Geneva School. Why does he do that? Because he's setting himself up against the Chicago School of neoclassical economics, which he sees as too scientistic, too empirical and quantitative, and the Geneva approach that he embraces sticks to ideas of abstraction, principle, legal framing, rather than even something as practical as taxation. So in that sense, it makes sense to me that they wouldn't be attention to taxation. It's too profane, right? It's like something that's too much part of the everyday practices of exchange, rather than the 10,000 feet up view that the Geneva School so prized. So that, I think, just to clarify, because absolutely Sandrine's counterhistory is absolutely essential here, and it was the one that was winning, right? I mean, the ILO sat in the Center William Rapart on the lake for a long time before the GATT took it over, and then for a long time before the WTO took it over and covered over the workers' murals that used to be on the walls.
It's uncovered.
And now they're uncovered. Oh yeah, trust me, I went there. I filled up my iPhone with pictures of the uncovered murals. But anyway, yeah, so just to clarify, and that's why I think we're in a wonderful moment of symmetry, because once again now, we're at the very moment that the neoliberals diagnosed in 1930s, which is that the arbitrary will of a single political leader can disrupt the complexity of a world trading system. the tariff liberation day when Trump unveiled his list of tariffs was the kind of things that would make Hayek wake up in cold sweats, right? Because it's the perfect kind of arbitrary, chaotic, unharmonious. It's the opposite of the Geneva School of neoliberalism, whatever that might be. So it's a great time, I think, again, not to put back together that world trading system, but to pose again the problem of the world, I think.
Yeah, also very good. I think the way in which here different things come together. I thought the story about Mantoux being the other founder of the Geneva Institute and being not exactly along the lines of Rapart is indeed very important, very telling. Reminds me of the London School of Economics, which the Fabians obviously founded, and where they combined the likes of Lasky and Robbins. So from the other perspective, from a socialist technocratic perspective add here, and Oakeshott, a conservative. So it's very interesting, and that means also, of course, that studying, say, neoliberal circles and looking at the institutions where people are hosted are not, is sort of like a complementary thing, because obviously at this point we only know that the two were friends, at least that's what the stories tell, but we don't know otherwise how the early institution sort of like developed, what kind of ideas are behind the teaching and the research, if they struggled, if they sort of like had a common purpose, and so on and so forth. So I thought that's actually really important. And then we see, of course, that intellectual institutions can be subject to very different influences, no? Can be subject to external influence. What did Rockefeller want? And how did that change over time? And why did they stop supporting the Institute eventually? And that can be very profane. I mean, it can be after the Second World War, Switzerland was considered well enough to pay for it by itself, no? But it can also have to do with a shifting funding profile, funding program, and then the different circles, which is the only thing that is really interesting. Because, of course, Mantoux and a lot that is linked to the International Labour Organization and so on is a different circuit of knowledge and questions, very much related to the social question. And the economic story, which is interested in maintaining that it is not about planning to recreate the world market, but by integrating, so the idea of, in your book, negative integration, that we need to remove barriers so that we can have a common whole, is exactly the opposite to the idea I need to structure a common whole. And I think there's very clear that these are absolutely contradictory approaches, and that we find, in fact, within this, even within the Mont Pèlerin Society, that basically we have the people who are extremely hostile, like in the old days, against trade unions, against anybody who infringes on labor markets, even in labor markets, and on those that are much more careful and say, okay, it's a part of the stabilization of neoliberal capitalism to actually believe that trade unions don't have to be class struggle organizations. And that was basically what Rapart and a few others were actually in the early discussions of the Mont Pèlerin Society holding against Makhlouf and Mises. And but it's really intriguing that the two lines, sort of like the social question and the economic questions, were basically both present in the Institute at the time. And yeah, I would like to know much more about it.
So just one question. Paul Mantoux wasn't the Mont Pèlerin Society?
No.
Yeah. That's fine. Thank you.
Very surprised.
Okay, no, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for this clarification and so on. So I absolutely agree with you, Dieter and Quinn, of course. So what I want to add is, first of all, of course, there is a very wide range of neoliberal in the 1920s, 1930s, and as we know, what will become the order liberals, I mean, Röpke in particular, and the German school, as we can say. I mean, they are different from the Viennese ones because they are more for state intervention. They put more emphasis on social stabilization and so on and so forth. So they're very different. And for example, a philosopher, a French philosopher, Serge Audier, has really, very well described, the kind of wide range neoliberals in that period. And in particular, Lippmann himself, he was French because he was mentioning France. Lippmann himself was a friend he mentioned in his book on the Lippmann. How do you say that in English? Lippmann colloquium. Was a friend of Keynes, for example, and he was very close to Keynes. So it's a very complicated story, and so what we label neoliberal, and that's why I understand. How your colleague was distancing himself from neoliberal, because the Chicago neoliberals are very different from the 1920s and 1930s, what we label neoliberals. I have another thing to say about Rockefeller. I worked myself on the Rockefeller archives in Sleepy Hollow, beautiful archives, by the way. So I really...
Unfortunately, they're in America.
They're in the United States, not in America. But very beautiful archives. And Rockefeller, they were. You have to. This philanthropic foundation, as they call themselves, I'm philanthropic because philanthropic is something very special in the US. So philanthropic foundation, the choice that they make is really is complicated to just summarize in one word. It's not because, for example, they stopped to fund the Graduate Institute after the Second World War, but then they found another institution in Paris, which is the École des hautes études en sciences sociales. They set up, they help funding the École des hautes études en sciences sociales. So in a way, they're funding things which they have the feeling is important at a certain period of time in a certain context. So we have to contextualize very closely the way they're funding, they're putting their funding. So, and the third thing that I want to say is about what was called the African Institute at the beginning, the Institut d'études et du développement. And Rist is a particular figure in this institute, of course, because, so there is a, Frémont, who set up, this institute. He was a professor in Lausanne and so on and so forth. It's a complicated story. My colleagues in Lausanne who have worked extensively on that, they would say, okay, so it's a kind of neo-colonial institution. So I wouldn't put the African Institute in the continuity of what I describe as the Durkheimian network in that period, at least. After it was founded in 1961, if I remember correctly, so it's another background, I would say. But of course, I was thinking exactly the same thing from the beginning. Oh yes, but I understand now because that. But in fact, there is another tradition which is behind this institute, which has been really worked very well researched by people in Lausanne, by historians in Lausanne. So that's what I wanted to say.
Just from the perspective of the colonies, I think a lot of French socialists would qualify for the label of neocolonial.
Yeah, I know. That's right, but not a Durkheimian at that time. I know you're right.
Thanks.
The affair in particular.
I just would like to react to the diagnostic. I can't pronounce in English. Diagnostic? Diagnosis. When you have words that are the same in French and in English, suddenly I can't pronounce them anymore. Diagnosis you posed. So you sort of draw the parallel between the time then and the time we're facing now. And it obviously raises the question of what we should do now, right? And that's a normative question, like which direction we should go. I'm thinking about that questions because the way I thought to end my talk initially was to sort of say, yes, developing countries are pushing for those negotiations to have this new United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Corporations, but at the same time we clearly see neoliberal ideas and the way international tax law has been developing over the past few years. For instance, arbitration is becoming a thing in tax, and I have colleagues, for instance, Martin Hirson, who've been tracing how that could happen, even though countries initially were very, very much against it because they saw this as a step too far in limiting their fiscal sovereignty. So to me, it really it raises this normative question, and I know it's not an easy question to ask. I don't think it's a question that's often asked to a historian, but I'd be very curious in hearing your views on that. Also because it's a question I constantly had in my mind when rereading your book. After every chapter, I was asking myself, like, oh, but what would have been the other way? And I was also asking myself the questions, but what would I have done if I had been at the place of people like Petersman and Rösler at the time? Would I have gone into a different direction or not, and why? And maybe one of the reasons why I had those questions in mind is because I've worked quite a lot with economists, and so to some extent I find those theories quite appealing in that they're quite clean. And so I really think we should ask those questions and try to answer them.
Thank you so much, Alice. Thank you again to the panel. So the floor is open for questions. I don't know whether there's somebody with a mic who, Jackie. Can you please wait for the mic?
Thank you very much. So thank you very much to all of you. And this is a question for Sandrine, Professor Sandrine Kott. I'm very interested in your idea that neoliberalism may be interpreted as an ethic or moral discourse, and I'd just like to hear more about that idea. Could you tell us in what way you see that it could be interpreted in that way? I find that very interesting. Thank you.
Shall we collect? Or?
Maybe we should do that, yeah. Are there any other? Yes.
Thank you also from my side to all of you for the presentation. It was fascinating. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more when you mentioned they prefer to stay at 10,000 feet. And nevertheless, they tried to discuss policy, right? In certain fields, they went down a little bit further in trade, for example, not in tax and so on. And I was wondering, again, to draw the parallels with today, if there were other issues that jumped to mind. I was thinking about currency, the proposal by I mean, they must have been discussing that, right? I mean, the pound is not relevant anymore, the dollar not yet, and so on. Perhaps gold, perhaps, if you could elaborate if there are other issues where you had a sense that they tried to drill a little bit deeper.
Take one more question.
Thank you very much, Peter Larson, University of Geneva. Question, if you step a bit forward in time and also consider the role of the Institute in a wider global context, I'm thinking of people like, and decentered perhaps context, I'm thinking of people like Hernando de Soto and the neoliberal projects he has been extensively involved in, also in rolling things out through his institute and so on, based in Lima, but really with global repercussions. And of course, passing through Geneva at some point in his training. So I was just wondering if you could maybe share a bit of insights, if you have any of that sort of continuity or so on. Thank you.
So you want to go first?
Sorry. Okay. Neoliberalism as a moral, it's entirely based on Foucault. I mean, lecture in 1978, 1979 at the Collège de France, in which he described, there is a lot of discussion around if is Foucault pro-neoliberal or anti-neoliberal anyway. But what he described in this lecture is that what is at the core of neoliberalism is being an entrepreneur de soi, a self-entrepreneur, entrepreneur of the self. So, which I find is absolutely interesting when you compare to what I said about, the ethical responsibility and so on, which is promoted by the Protestants, in particular regarding the non-regulation of capitalism. I mean, non-binding regulation of capitalism. I think that there is an answer to the non-binding regulation of capitalism by the World Council of Churches and other Protestant churches, because I just mentioned the World Council of Churches because it is in Geneva, but I looked at other archives, which is very close to this thing, which is very close to entrepreneur de soi, which is a moral, in a certain way, an ethical stance, and has nothing to do with a kind of economic, program.
Closer to order liberalism because reciprocity.
Or Weber.
Yeah, but it's centered on the individual itself. I mean, it's not centered on regulation or whatever. Okay, so.
Yeah, maybe I'll say a couple of things where the neoliberals got their hands dirty, so to speak, and then talk about how I think actually the De Soto model flips some of the Geneva School stuff in interesting ways. So on the question of 10,000 feet up, so this is something I found interesting, partially just because of my own naivety when I started researching this. But when I was interested in the intellectual origins of the World Trade Organization, I hadn't studied economics, I'd studied other things, political history, and I didn't know what to expect if I looked in the kind of drafting papers or the negotiations or the journal articles that would lead into the signing of the creation of the WTO in Marrakesh in 1994. I suppose if I had guessed, I would have thought that there would be some arguments based on historical developments, projections, volumes of trade, relative balance of payments, but there weren't, actually. No, the negotiations for the WTO were based much more on abstract principles of reciprocity, mutual openness, non-discrimination. There was very little history. In fact, it's very important that there not be history, because if you include history, immediately the idea of universal principles in matters of trade in highly uneven developed parts of the world becomes absurd. You would need to account for the fact that parts of the world had been colonized and so on. So you had a very abstract discourse within, as those people who know this would know, the generalized system of preferences, so a general carve-out for self-declared developing countries. But I would say a 10,000 feet up discourse. Were they getting their hands dirty? Absolutely. Interestingly, you can get your hands dirty from 10,000 feet, it turns out. Maybe Switzerland may be a particularly good place to do that. Secondly, on monetary issues, so there's a book coming out that's already in German by Matthias Schmelzer, a colleague of ours, on neoliberal debates around money, and he gets into great detail about the so-called Bellagio group, which was Gottfried Haberler, who actually got his start here in Geneva doing a League of Nations business cycle research, and Fritz Machlup as very active policy entrepreneurs to push floating exchange rates, so that the end of Bretton Woods in 1971 ends up being partially realized by the convening power and the entrepreneurial mobilization of economists with policymakers and business people, in which neoliberals very much exercise their opinion about the sterility of a fixed exchange rate model, which incidentally was partially based on Charles Kindleberger, to talk about someone who was more of the social democratic Keynesian managed capitalism school, who also taught here in the summers in the 1930s. So the factions were always warring. De Soto is really interesting. So Dieter and I are in town, so to speak, to take part in a workshop that we co-organized in Lausanne tomorrow and the next day. And there are 2 papers about De Soto. So he's fresh in my mind. Not only did he do his postgraduate work here, but he did something really fascinating, which is he was a participant in what I would say the kind of inversion of neoliberal strategy. So if we think about everything from the 1930s to the 1990s from the neoliberal side as more or less about constraining democratic majorities, building in counter-majoritarian principles such that certain core principles of economic freedom, private property, and so on would not be disrupted excessively. That was an institutionally strenuous project. It was not just unleashing markets or unfettering markets. It was, as I call it, encasing markets. So doing negative integration takes as many laws as doing positive integration. Go ask someone who signed a bilateral investment treaty recently how many of those there are. That's in the spirit of supposed reciprocity and openness. It takes a lot of legal work and a lot of legal fees to get these things done. What De Soto did, though, was he went back to Lima and he said, what am I going to do now? I'm going to have 3 people on the panel. James Buchanan, big believer in constitutional constraints. Hayek, big believer in constitutional constraints. And an unlicensed street peddler from Lima, who's also going to be there. And he's going to tell his story. And he's going to say, you know what regulation does to me? It means that I get bugged by the cops. I can't sell my goods the way I want to. I want economic freedom from the bottom up. And that means a different kind of project than encasing markets and constraining majorities. It means about empowering small-level entrepreneurs, titling of informal property, and eventually things like, rousing people the way that someone like Javier Milei does by saying, we need to use the markets against the elites. I mean, this last week was an incredible neoliberal moment for me where Milei described the people who have been keeping American dollars in their mattresses as heroes. He said, if you've been avoiding taxes for the last couple of decades, you're a hero. You refuse to be expropriated by our corrupt, inflationary, elite class. So that turned to the grassroots that De Soto pulled off extraordinarily successfully. I think he's one of the most influential neoliberal thinkers of the last 40 years. But precisely by not operating from Geneva. He came to Geneva, but then he took the Lima approach that I think, tells us a lot about how one can operate at different scales for similar outcomes. Do you want to add something on De Soto?
On the De Soto is only also interesting that if you don't have titles to the land, you cannot sell it. And if you have a lot of people that are sitting on land and have no titles, the only way to remove them is by police. And then you have a social conflict of certain amount. So part of the project was also driven by giving opportunities to get access to land for mineral resource exploitation. But I mean, the story of the titling as an expansion of business opportunities for poor people, of course, is a very important dimension of Jamie Pecker's called the rolling out neoliberalism. No? Roughly in the beginning, the fight against the welfare state was much more of a defensive attitude, and then over the last 20, 30, 40 years, we have seen, of course, many more aspects of transforming welfare states, much more conforming to insurance principles and so on and so forth. I was thinking, one of the reasons, there were times that Friedman had suggested one should close the Mont Pèlerin Society in, I believe, the 1970s. Basically, the program considered to be done. And then many of the people who were organized neoliberals suggested, no, program is not done, and they continued. And up to this day, so everybody who wants to can, of course, look at in which ways nowadays people who are part of this neoliberal networks are discussing all kinds of policy issues. And one of the reasons to maintain actually this circle is that neoliberals, like many other people, are not so sure about everything and need the space to work out certain ideas, figure out, is this right, is this wrong? And if you do it historically, you can see, okay, originally people who were in development studies were actually not really very neoliberal. They were very much inspired by colonial economics. And it took a while until Peter Bauer and then de Paglal and others started to actually get rid of some of the stuff of the old times and developed a new approach until now recently people come back who kind of reintroduce racist and neo-colonial attitudes. But then is, of course, the question, is this still neoliberal, or is this actually, again, something quite quite different. I mean, that's exactly why we need the discussion. What do we really understand about as neoliberal? And of course, Foucault was very much inspired by reading human capital theory, the Virginia School people, and the theory of the entrepreneur of the self comes very much from this specific wing. And it doesn't fit at all, by the way, with what Röpke and Rapin and many others thought, who were very keen on keeping a separate sort of like agricultural life, subsistence life. And so they were not at all about, and so in Foucault's definition, they were not neoliberal, and I believe they were quite neoliberal, and I think Foucault was wrong. but
the entrepreneur of the self is very good.
Yeah, of course, for many aspects of the transformation it's good, but not really as a good definition of sort of like what neoliberalism amounts. I think one of the really interesting areas, I mean, in the Mont Pèlerin Society, looking at the larger group, doesn't catch all, because of course you have a select group with 1,200 people, but it's evident lots of economists, next largest group lawyers from the academic disciplines, and then sort of like all kinds of others, but sort of like very specifically interesting for the purpose of the discourse, economists and lawyers. And if you think of the evolution of statehood beyond the traditional nation state and the efforts to put together the world economy again, then of course these non-state types of social order that are actually negotiated with the help of the lawyers are really important. The fastest growing area is arbitration law on international investment. Huge, thousands of arbitration cases which basically bypass international public-public relationships and try to achieve order for property rights and the distribution of what has been gained between private parties. And so it's very interesting also with regard to the question, in the old days one would think, okay, we need to stabilize a world economy, a world state, even Mises would think so. And nowadays we can actually see that the real way in which neoliberal evolutions have gone have actually bypassed public state authority and have created all kinds of alternatives by, for example, very important aspect in the legal sphere. And so there's a lot of room where one needs simply to continue to look at what actually the history is bringing us.
Thank you. Did you?
I don't really have anything to add. No.
I think we have time for one more round of questions with short questions and short responses.
So going back to Alice Pirlo's ending questions, so it's more on the normative side here, but I would like to hear your position when it comes to the moral stance. Going back to Quinn, so you said that nowadays economics is mainly based on statistics, models, and the moral stance is pretty much just not there, right? So economists are just plotting models and plugging in numbers and discussing these. But who is in charge of these moral normative questions here? If it's not economists anymore, who are not perhaps daring to do them, because I know that. So going back in history, Cambridge, Oxford, which was home to economists, was very much philosophical, was very much encouraging them to take up stances and asking these bold questions. I also see it myself because I study at the University of St. Gallen, and I also see that this is not really as much factored in anymore, except in history classes, in social classes, psychology classes, but in econ, in business classes, this is not there anymore. So I think these are important questions, and I would like to hear your view, and also perhaps Alice Pirlo.
Ask the question because I didn't have the answer. I'll pass the microphone to you first.
Sure, maybe I can say something and then you can respond. Yeah, so I think, I tend to default to thinking about these smaller stories and smaller histories. And one thing I think it's really important to emphasize with, I think, the approach that Dieter and I take to this question, the history of neoliberalism, is it is very much a dialogic and dialectical one that is defined through conflict with opponents. So what neoliberalism is at any given time is often best understood in relation to what they see as the primary threat to the stability of the capitalist order. So that may be in the 1930s fascists, in the 1950s it might be Keynesians, in the 1960s and 70s it might be decolonizing countries, in the 1990s it might be green movements and ecological activists. And the response then is conditioned according to the danger and the threat. And then how that is then absorbed can go in two ways, either a doubling down on opposition, and if the work that Dieter is doing recently on the history of climate denial think tanks is an example of that. So from the late 1980s onward, you have neoliberal think tanks that are just sowing doubt, refusing the science, acting as if none of this is true. So there's a kind of hard opposition. Some other approaches, Ernst Ulrich Petersmann, for one, would be to try to absorb partially some of the challenges to come up with a kind of more equilibrium state that could maybe satisfy people. So he's someone who I did say was only interested in abstract principles 10,000 feet up in the late 1980s and early 1990s. But after the Seattle protests, after the wave of anti and alter globalization protests, he actually changed his tune. So if you look at what he says in that review of my book or the work that he's done in the last 10 or 15 years, he said, actually, you know what, we do need to take into account questions of climate change, questions of labor laws, questions of social inequality. It's only if we address those things, maybe tokenistically, maybe superficially, but that then gets absorbed for him into this idea of what is ordo, like what is the new version of normative morality, in fact, that needs to be baked into those abstract principles. So I don't think that it's a question entirely of rinsing out all normativity or moral questions or questions of humanitarianism even. I think actually often the way that the legal debates have gone is to try to write them in and then figure out, the ways that one can get to them with the least, loss of efficiency and productivity and so on. One thing I'll say directly in response to Alice's provocation earlier is a very interesting moment in global tax governance, right? I mean, I don't know if I've ever said those words before, but it actually is. Because you have very clear competing models of what should be done, right? You have the OECD model, which is basically the rich countries getting together and saying, okay, we see there's a problem, can we come up with a working solution? You have then global South nations saying, this is messed up, why are we being left out of negotiations again? We want to truly globalize this and do this at the UN and do it as an extension and expansion of what global governance is. And then now you have, of course, the new Trump 2.0 version, which is just like, screw you everyone, we're not part of anything global anymore. So you have, you can map it out quite clearly, and you can actually now, I think, come to some counterintuitive speculations, which is that the American refusal of cooperation and its willful removal of itself from the game might actually be better than if they had stayed in and played the role of constantly just making small concessions, humping along, withdrawing, humping along, withdrawing. Maybe now actually in the absence of the United States, there can be a more rigorous, global governance minus USA model that might actually have more traction because the US has the room of maneuver of the global hegemon and is constantly too tempted, whether a Democrat's in power or Republican is in power, to just make use of that autonomy that they have that no one else has. Now that they have maybe just subtracted themselves from the debate, perhaps there can be a kind of a different settlement. And this is something that's making free trade liberals quite excited, actually. The EU-Mercosur free trade agreement, which took 25 years of negotiations, just passed in December. Why? Because Trump was elected. So it was now an attitude of like, well, we're not going to bother trying to, create a free trading system again with the US. They're done now. So let's do everything around them. So I think that one can see some signs of hope for rebooted international cooperation, perhaps, despite the bleak appearance of things.
Yeah, maybe just two short comments on what you said, but also on one of the questions you asked. You mentioned the work of Petersman. That was him, right? Yeah. That shifted from those high-level abstract principles to more engagement with human rights, climate change, environmental protections, and other values. It's true, and he explains that in the review and elsewhere. But it's important to be aware that it's been criticized by human rights lawyers for instrumentalizing human rights. And basically, yes, so basically creating a priority between different types of human rights and putting at the top the right to property. And so it's his work as sort of, or is sort of described in that literature as being a bit in silo with the very vast literature on human rights. So that's one first thing I wanted to mention, and the other thing was related to your question on the role of economic professor. So I'm not an economist, and I don't want to speak in their name, right, or on their behalf, but I don't think it's true that they're no longer taking any normative stance. I can maybe just give you an anecdote. I'll always remember this economic professor, who is also a very good friend, joking and asking another law colleague whether it should be for lawyers to design tax policy or for economists. And when asking the question, obviously what he meant is that economists should be in charge of deciding on how the tax system should look like, and lawyers should just implement. The economist is the architecture, and the lawyer is just the builder. And so this, to me, very much reveals that economists, it's just an anecdote, right? But I think it's generally true that economists still takes normative stance. They might not be explicit about it. And if you're studying at St. Gallen, I would very much encourage you, to challenge your professor to be explicit about the assumptions that underlie the analysis and their work. So I wanted to make the comment because I think it's very important to be aware of normative messages that underlie someone's work, even if there is no explicit normative stance that's being taken.
Thank you. I think we've pretty much run out of time. In fact, we just have a couple of minutes to wind up. Thank you all very much for this wonderfully stimulating panel, and thank you all for being present here today and participating in the conversation. Our topic for today is the Graduate Institute and neoliberalism, and perhaps, we can go away from here with the message that we're probably not just one of the original homes of neoliberalism, but also crossroads of ideas. And maybe going forward, that could be a more stimulating message to take away from this conversation and the Institute. Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you.